There's a kind of silence that speaks louder than any argument. It doesn't come from a place of manipulation, it comes from clarity, from knowing that you're no longer begging for someone to see your worth. And here's what's powerful. When you go silent, you give someone the space to show you who they really are without your constant reminders, your explanations, or your emotional labor. It's in that silence that the truth begins to echo. Not just for you, but for him. Because while you may be quiet on the outside, a storm starts building inside his mind. So what does he think? Day by day, as your absence stretches longer than his ego expected. Let's break it down, because your silence is not just a pause, it's a mirror, and sooner or later he has to look into it. The first few days after you go silent, he doesn't panic. In fact, there's a good chance he barely notices the shift at first, not because he doesn't care, but because he doesn't have to care. Yet. He assumes this is just a passing mood. Maybe you're upset, maybe you're trying to make a point, but in his mind, you'll come back around, you always do, and that assumption is important because it shows where his priorities lie. He's not trying to reach for you. He's waiting for you to reset the emotional balance again. That's the ego at work. The ego doesn't allow a man to admit that your silence has thrown him off balance. It doesn't want him to acknowledge that you might be slipping through his fingers. So instead, it tells him a comforting story. She's just being dramatic. Or she'll text me tomorrow. Or worse, she needs me more than I need her. The truth is, people only get comfortable when history tells them they can be. And if you've always been the one to initiate conversation, to fix problems, to make the effort when he withdraws, you've unknowingly trained him to expect your return. And so in these first few days, he leans back, not forward. He carries on as normal, confident that silence is temporary and that the power is still in his hands. But what he doesn't realize yet is that something has shifted. Maybe this time you're not just quiet because you're upset. Maybe you're quiet because you're finally listening to yourself. Maybe for the first time you're choosing to see what he does without your voice filling in the blanks, without your energy fueling the relationship, without your emotional generosity keeping things alive. And it's exactly that shift that begins to stir something uncomfortable in him, even if he can't put it into words. Because when someone who usually gives energy goes quiet, the absence is louder than any spoken demand. He might start checking his phone a little more often. Maybe he notices you haven't liked his latest post, or you didn't reply to something he casually sent. But again, ego steps in. He shrugs it off. She's just trying to get a reaction. He tells himself you're playing a game, that you're just trying to manipulate his attention. But what he doesn't know is that you've stopped playing the game entirely. You've stopped texting not to provoke him, but because you're finally done chasing clarity from someone who always keeps it just out of reach. That distinction is everything. Silence is only manipulative when it's used as a tactic, but when it's a decision, when it's you reclaiming your peace, that's not manipulation, that's self-respect. Still, during these early days, he may respond with a false sense of security. He'll think silence is still part of the familiar rhythm. He might even feel a little amused, telling himself that this will blow over. But even in that confident exterior, there's a flicker of something else, and a little voice in the back of his mind that says, what if this time is different? And that's where it begins. That's the seed of doubt. It's small at first, and he'll do everything he can to ignore it, to bury it under distractions, friends, work, or even other women, but it's there because silence makes people confront things they've been avoiding. And the longer yours lasts, the more space he has to realize how much of the relationship was being held up by you, your effort, your availability, your emotional labor. And now that it's gone, he's not quite sure what to do with the emptiness. But in these first few days, his ego is still louder than his heart. So he won't reach out. Not yet. He'll wait for the pattern to repeat itself. And if it does, you reach out first, he'll breathe a silent sigh of relief, because then he doesn't have to change. He doesn't have to grow. He doesn't have to take responsibility. The cycle continues and he gets to stay exactly where he's been, comfortable. But if you stay silent, if you remain grounded in your decision to pause and observe instead of chase, that's when things begin to shift. Slowly and quietly, his thoughts get heavier. His confidence starts to crack. And most importantly, the illusion that he can take your presence for granted begins to fall apart. And all of that starts right here in those first 3 days when you choose not to break the silence. When you resist the urge to explain, to justify, or to plead, when you allow his imagination to wander in the absence of your constant reassurance. Silence doesn't punish, it reveals. And right now he's not thinking, how do I fix this? He's thinking, she'll come back. But if you don't, he'll be forced to wonder why, and eventually forced to confront whether he ever really showed up in the first place. By the 4th or 5th day, something begins to shift. What was once silence he dismissed as a phase becomes a presence that lingers. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, just a quiet absence that he can't seem to ignore. He thought you'd reach out by now. He expected a message, a check-in, maybe even a hey, masked as something casual, but it never came. And now that same ego that once told him you were just being emotional starts to feel less certain. This is the phase where curiosity starts to chip away at his confidence. He starts to wonder not just about you, but about himself. Did I do something wrong? Was I too distant? Is she seeing someone else? He doesn't ask these questions out loud, of course. That would mean admitting that your silence has gotten under his skin. Instead, he becomes subtle, passive. He might watch your story without reacting. He might scroll past your posts slower than usual, looking for signs. He doesn't engage, but he's observing closely. There's a kind of tension that builds in the space where communication used to live. He notices the moments where you'd normally reach out. He feels them. Not because you were predictable, but because you were consistent. And consistency, when removed, creates disruption, a shift in rhythm. And when that rhythm breaks, he starts to realize just how much of his life was propped up by your emotional availability. He notices how often your name used to light up his phone. And now that it's not there, he has to face the emptiness. Still, he doesn't reach out. Pride won't let him. He convinces himself it's not a big deal. He tells himself, you're just taking space. But the longer it goes, the more uncomfortable he becomes. And that discomfort grows in quiet moments. Not when he's busy or distracted, but in the small pauses, the ride home, the time before bed, the mornings when his phone is quiet. Those are the moments when he starts to miss the energy you used to bring. The check-ins, the care, the connection. He replays conversations in his mind, looking for signs of where things shifted. He might reread your old messages, scrolling through threads, seeing now what he ignored before. The emotional effort, the softness, the way you made him feel important, even when he didn't deserve it. He starts to remember the things he brushed off, the way you used to notice the small details, the way you asked about his day, The way you gave him attention without needing anything in return. This is the week where the memory of you becomes louder than the silence. And with it comes a new question. Is she over me? That thought hits differently. It's not just about curiosity anymore. It's about his place in your life. Because up until now, he's operated under the assumption that you'll always be there, orbiting around him in some way. And now for the first time, he's not so sure. He may even start to feel a little panicked, though he won't admit it. He might try to provoke a reaction, a vague story, a cryptic post. That's something to test the waters, to see if you'll react. But when you don't, when you remain grounded in your silence, he's left with only his own thoughts. And those thoughts aren't kind. He begins to question his actions. Not because he's had a grand revelation, but because your silence has forced him into self-reflection. The very thing he avoided when you were there. Offering emotional explanations, seeking resolution, is now unavoidable. Your absence creates the very clarity he refused to face. He might ask mutual friends about you casually, not too obvious, but enough to try to gather information. How's she been? Is she seeing anyone? It's subtle but intentional. He wants to know where your head is at without having to show his cards, because at this point the game has changed and he knows it. See, what he thought would be a temporary moment has now become a shift in power. Not because you're trying to take control, but because you've reclaimed your peace. That scares him more than any argument or outburst ever could. Arguments he knows how to deal with. Silence, that's unfamiliar. And in that unfamiliarity, he's left to question everything he's done and everything he didn't do. This is where the emotional tables begin to turn. He's no longer as certain, no longer in control, and deep down he knows it. That's the power of not chasing. The power of stepping back, not to punish, but to observe. To see what someone does when you stop filling in all the emotional gaps. And in this week, that's exactly what you're doing. You're observing. Not waiting, not hoping, not manipulating, just watching. Watching who he becomes without your emotional labor. And he's starting to realize that without it, he's more alone than he thought. And the most uncomfortable truth of all, he's not sure whether you're coming back. By the second week, the silence has gone from confusing to unsettling. What started as a momentary pause has now taken root as something more permanent. He's no longer just curious, he's bothered. And not in a reactive, impulsive way. This is the kind of bother that sits quietly in the pit of his stomach, whispering questions he doesn't want to answer. Questions that force him to confront himself in ways your presence used to protect him from. He starts to feel the weight of the quiet. He notices how often he looks at his phone and hopes your name shows up. Not because he wants to win, not because he wants validation, but because he's starting to miss you. Not just the attention, not just the convenience, but the feeling of being seen, the feeling of being known, because you didn't just give him company, you gave him intimacy. You made him feel understood. And that kind of connection doesn't just disappear, it echoes. So now he finds himself scrolling through your messages, not out of nostalgia, but out of regret. Regret for the times he ignored your concerns. Regret for brushing off the way you were always the one making an effort. Regret for assuming you'd always be there. He reads words you once sent with new eyes. Messages he once skimmed now feel full of warmth he didn't appreciate. And the worst part, he can't respond to them. Because those messages are in the past. You're not sending new ones. And every day you remain silent, the past starts to feel further and further away. This is the phase where realization creeps in. not as a dramatic awakening, but as a slow, steady truth. He didn't show up for you when he had the chance, and now he's not sure if he'll get another. That realization is painful, not just because it means losing you, but because it exposes him. It reveals a version of himself he doesn't want to face. A version that took love for granted, that confused your loyalty with permanence, that assumed patience had no expiration date. He starts to replay your arguments in his mind, the little ones, the ones he brushed off or walked away from, the moments you tried to explain how you felt only to be met with defensiveness or silence. He sees them differently now, because now he's the one sitting in the silence. And it doesn't feel powerful, it feels hollow. But still, pride holds him back. Reaching out would mean admitting he was wrong. It would mean risking vulnerability. And for someone who has built emotional walls to protect his ego, that's terrifying. So instead of messaging you, he keeps wrestling with himself. He tells himself, maybe you just need more time. Maybe you're just busy. But deep down, he knows this silence isn't about time. It's about choice. And for once, you're not choosing him. That shift is humbling because for the first time, he's not sure if he's still important to you. And that uncertainty is what begins to unravel him. It starts small. Maybe he types out a message, then deletes it. Maybe he drafts a story, hoping you'll see it and respond. Maybe he watches your posts obsessively, looking for clues. But nothing gives him the clarity he wants because he's not hearing from you. And it's your silence, not your absence, that is driving him inward. It's during this week that his inner dialogue changes. Before, he wondered why you were quiet. And now he's wondering why he didn't treat you better. Why he waited until the silence to value your voice. Why it took losing your attention to appreciate your presence. And whether or not he says it out loud, regret begins to settle in his chest like a weight. Because no one misses a person who begged for love louder than the person who took it for granted. And here's the ironic part. This is often the moment where he starts to feel what you felt for so long. The overthinking, the uncertainty, the emotional limbo, all the things you carried in the relationship alone are now showing up in his world. Only now, there's no one to soothe him, no one to explain it away, no one to say, I'm still here, because you've stopped filling that role. That's why silence is so powerful. Not because it punishes, but because it transfers the emotional responsibility back where it belongs. For so long, you carried the weight of communication, connection, clarity. Now that you've let go, he has to face the emptiness left behind and figure out if he's willing to grow enough to fill it. But even in this realization, he may not reach out. Not yet. Because knowing what he lost and admitting it to you are two very different things. His pride is still at war with his heart, and so he stays in the tension, hoping you'll give him an opening, a sign, a breadcrumb, something to tell him that you're still his, even if he never earned it. But if that sign doesn't come, if you remain silent, he has no choice but to feel everything he once avoided, and maybe for the first time, he understands what it means to be on the other side of indifference. And that understanding, that's when the regret becomes real. By the third week and beyond, something inside him shifts, not because time has passed, but because your silence has done what no conversation ever could. It's held up a mirror. And he's finally looking into it. At first, that mirror was foggy. He saw bits and pieces, some discomfort, some regret, some confusion. But now, it's clear. Painfully clear. He sees the pattern. He sees how he showed up. And for the first time, he sees what it cost him. Because you're not just taking a break. you're gone. Not physically, maybe, but energetically, emotionally. You've withdrawn the one thing he always counted on, your availability. Now he's left alone with a decision that only he can make. And it's not about sending a text or calling you in the middle of the night. It's not about a grand romantic gesture. It's deeper than that. It's the decision between protecting his ego or reclaiming something real. By this point, the silence is no longer something he's waiting out. He's starting to realize it's something he might have to live with. And that changes everything. He's no longer pacing with questions like, is she mad? Or when will she text me? Those questions have evolved into something more raw, more honest. Did I lose her? Do I even deserve her back? He's not just missing you now. He's facing the possibility that he might never get another chance to make it right. And that terrifies him, not because he can't find someone else, but because deep down, he knows he won't find you again. Not the way you loved, not the way you gave, not the way you showed up, even when he didn't. And now he's caught between two forces, fear and pride. The fear is real. The fear says, if I don't do something, I'll lose her for good. But pride is louder. Pride says, stay silent. Don't look weak. She left, remember? And in that space between fear and pride, indecision becomes its own kind of paralysis. He plays out both scenarios in his head. If he reaches out and you reject him, that hurts. But if he never reaches out and you move on forever, that's a pain he won't admit, but he'll carry. This is when the power dynamic becomes full visible. So, because silence isn't about winning or losing, it's about truth. And right now, the truth is, you stopped feeding the version of the relationship that kept him comfortable. You stopped being the emotional cushion he leaned on without gratitude. And now he has to figure out who he is without your constant reassurance. Some men in this moment double down on ego. They tell themselves, she wasn't the one. They act unbothered. They distract themselves with other women, convince themselves they're fine, post more, party more. But even in all that noise, they feel the echo of your absence. And they know, deep down, it's not the same. Others, they crack. They break through the pride and they come forward. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not with the words you want to hear right away, but they show up, humbled, scared, raw, because they finally realize something it took your silence to teach them. They had something valuable and they let it slip through their fingers. But that realization, it only comes when you stay still, when you resist the urge to go back and explain everything to him one more time, when you stop trying to fix, to prove, to win. Your silence isn't a weapon. It's a boundary. It says, if you want me, come correct, come honest, come whole, not with excuses, not with charm, but with accountability. This final stretch of silence becomes a test of his emotional maturity. Can he recognize what he lost? More importantly, can he take action from that recognition? Not just to win you back, but to grow from the experience. Because it's one thing to miss someone, it's another to change because of them. If he doesn't reach out, it's not always because he doesn't care. Sometimes it's because he's afraid. Afraid of your silence confirming what he already suspects, that you've moved on, that you're no longer waiting, that you've closed the chapter. And if that's the case, let that be the truth. Because no woman should have to break her own silence just to prove she was worth chasing. The right man doesn't need you to fill in the blanks. He doesn't need hints or reminders. When your silence is met with reflection and growth, he will know what to do. He won't wait for the perfect moment. He'll reach out. He'll take the risk. because the cost of losing you will finally outweigh the cost of his pride. And if he never does, then he answered the question for you, not with words, but with inaction. And that too is clarity, because the way someone responds to your silence tells you everything about the role they were ever meant to play in your life.